So, we've all had this experience of expecting something to be a certain way and it's different. I was listening to a neuroscientist talk about how our brains work in a podcast a few weeks ago, and he was talking about how our brains are pattern recognition systems and they are prediction systems. We have all this data and all this input that comes into our brains, and it has to sort it out. And so it sorts things out into patterns, and that's how we see things. And it also, we go through our days and we anticipate things, and we think this is, so we think that X is going to be really fun for us, or this is going to be really crummy for us. And a lot of times we're wrong about that. A lot of times the expectations we have turn out to be not what we expected, right? And so there's actually memes about this on the internet, about expectations versus reality. So would you like to see some? Yes. All right. So think about Christmas, expectations versus reality. The expectation of the joy with Santa, and then of course the reality. Amen. What about sleeping with pets? Anybody sleep with pets here? The expectation versus the reality. The expectation of studying with friends. Yeah. So that's from a movie whose name I will not say. What about when you wake up? The expectation of what it's like when you wake up versus the reality. And then, of course, what about winter? The expectations of winter versus the reality. Now, this happens in all kinds of things, large things, small things. Some of us have had expectations about what our married life was going to be like. And then the reality has been very different and difficult. Some of us maybe had expectations about what our job was going to be like, what our career was going to be like, and then the expectations really are different, or whatever. It can be, the expectations can be better or worse. They can often be mismatched. And today, we're talking about Jesus, and Jesus as the Messiah. And the people in Jesus' time, the expectations that they had, and how they were different. How Jesus actually came to be different than what they expected. And again, it's been a theme throughout this message series, but we'll come back to it again today. How for us, we have expectations of Jesus and how Jesus is going to come into our life and change it. And oftentimes our expectation is going to make it easier, right? And it doesn't always work that way. So expectations versus reality. J. David Hoke is a New Testament author or a New Testament scholar, and he says this about the Palm Sunday, Christ's entrance into Jerusalem. He said that when Jesus comes to us, we must receive him for who he is as he comes. He may not come to us as we expect him to. We may be waiting for a certain sign which never appears, but he does come. And the real question is, will we receive him? You know, the Gospel of John begins with a little bit of a prologue, kind of fancy language. And one of the things it says is that Jesus came into the world. He came to that which was his own, the writer says, that Jesus had been, you know, as God, the second person of the Trinity. He was involved in the creation of the world. He created this world. He comes into the world, and the thing that he created, the people that he created, did not receive him. So let's talk about this. The surprising, expectation-defying experience of Jesus coming into the world, especially as it sort of manifests itself on Palm Sunday. So first off, it's a little bit of a different kind of thing than you would expect for Jesus coming into Jerusalem during this time. This is, again, in the Old Testament, or in the during Jesus' time, this was the Passover. This was the time that people were gathered from around the world, really, to come to Jerusalem and to sacrifice at the temple, to remember the Old Testament story of the Passover. So all this stuff is happening in Jerusalem, and Jesus comes into town. So first, it's surprising in that for almost all of his ministry, Jesus has sort of been on the down low. Even though crowds were flocking to him, as you know, he was popular, but he was careful about where he went, and he was careful about, as he said, sort of entrusting himself to people because he knew what people would do. And so he would sometimes even do miracles, and he would tell people, don't tell anybody about this, because as he said, my time has not yet come. And he knew that there was going to be opposition to him, and so he was not public in a lot of the things he did. But here, he comes and makes it's a spectacle. It's a big thing that Jesus comes into town. And he also, it's unusual in that he's riding on a colt, which is, it's a donkey, a young donkey, right? And this has some pretty significant symbolism to it. Jesus was very intentional about this, and doing this, coming into Jerusalem at that time in this way, was a very powerful and dramatic statement that Jesus was making. Now, this has some background. One of the elements of the background is 1 Kings chapter 1, which tells the story of the transition of power from King David to King Solomon. And some of you have been, if you've been in church for a long time, you've heard stories about King David, and towards the end of his life, he has sons that are competing with each other to take over the throne. And it's like could be a TV series, like a dramatic thing, because there's a lot of stuff going on. Well, one of those debates, or one of these conflicts that's going on, is David is almost dead. He's not even talking. And one of his sons decides to get a bunch of support around him and proclaim himself to be the king. And they hear about this, and it's like the David kind of revives himself and actually speaks and gives these instructions because he wants his son Solomon to take over and become the next king. And so they do this whole thing where Solomon gets anointed by Samuel, the prophet Samuel, and he comes into town riding on a colt. And that was like a big deal of Solomon coming in to town, processing, and people are proclaiming him king as he's coming into town, processing on a colt. So that's one of the backgrounds. Also, it's a prophecy in the Old Testament. Zechariah makes this prophecy. It says, "Rejoice, O greatly, O people of Zion. Shout in triumph, O people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you, righteous and victorious. Yet he is humble, riding on a donkey, even on a donkey's colt." And so the idea is that the prophet Zechariah is saying there's going to come this king who's going to come to you, but he's not going to be on a big war horse. He's going to come on a donkey. And so that is in people's minds when Jesus comes into Jerusalem riding on a colt. These two things about their history. And then we see the crowd's reaction, which, again, we're so familiar with the story, it just sort of seems like, well, yeah, that's what happened. But yet, it was quite striking at the time. So our passage says that people spread their cloaks on the road, and other people spread branches, palm branches. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." Now, if you have your Bible there, probably you will see each of these phrases has an asterisk by it or a footnote by it, because all of these sayings come from the other parts of the Old Testament, particularly Psalm 118. So they're giving these quotes from Psalm 118, which was a victory psalm in the Old Testament. And it's what the Israelites focused on during the Passover. They are reminding themselves of the victory that God gave the Israelite people when he took them out of Egypt. And so again, when Jesus comes into town on this colt, the people, it's like they realize something big is going on. God is coming to save people, and Jesus is the one who's saving people. So this is a big deal that they're shouting these things, they're proclaiming these things and putting down palm branches, because that's the second thing, is what's the deal with the palm branches? And I think we've talked about this before since I've been here. And if you've been at other churches, I'm sure you've heard this talked about before, but let's just go over it one more time. What happened here, and the people, the person coming into town on a colt or whatever, and the people laying palm branches, that's what they had done not that long before. So, well, it goes back to the Maccabean revolt. So when Jews celebrate Hanukkah, do you know what they're celebrating? They're celebrating the Maccabean revolt. And that was a powerful experience that the people of Israel had. This was about 160 BC. And so if you think about this, the Old Testament and the history of the Jews up until the time of Christ, it's kind of crazy. They create this great kingdom, and the kingdom rolls for a little while, and then they're captured by the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, and that's kind of the end of the Old Testament. Well, after that, in history, we know that you have Alexander the Great rises up, and so then they're conquered by the Greeks. And the Maccabean revolt is when they successfully, at least for a time, revolted and kicked the Greeks out of Palestine. So Maccabean actually means hammer. In I guess it would be the Old Testament language. So it was a couple of guys. It was a guy and his son. And they fought on a couple of different occasions. And this is key, you guys. One of the aspects of this Maccabean revolt is that the guy, I think it was Judas Maccabeus, cleansed the temple. He kicked the Jews, or kicked the Greeks, the pagan people, out of the temple, and then came back into town riding on I don't know if it was a donkey or a horse, and the people then put these palm branches down, making that way for him. And so, again, if you think about the fact that these are people who understand history and they celebrate history, they're very nationalistic, they recognize Jesus is doing something significant here, and they're putting down palm branches. Expectations, right? Their expectations are, this guy is coming into town to be our king, to overthrow the Romans, just like the Maccabees did back in the day. This is going to be awesome. He's going to cleanse the temple from all these Roman jerks, and he's going to save us. That's what they expected. J. David Hoke again says this: as long as Jesus held the expectation of salvation from Roman oppression, the crowd would receive him with shouts of jubilation. As long as he fulfilled their expectation, they would follow him. But was their reception a reception of Jesus on his terms? Was their reception a commitment to him and to his kingdom? It certainly was not. They were wanting Jesus to come and help them build their kingdom, which again was a very nationalistic thing. And again, the crazy thing is, Jesus comes and cleanses the temple, all right, but he doesn't cleanse the Romans out of the temple. He cleanses the sacrificial system out of the temple. What? Very, very different than they expected. Very, very different than they wanted. But again, that's who Jesus was. So you have the unexpected Jesus. And what do you do? What do you do when Jesus comes into your life, when Jesus comes into our world, and it's not what we expected, not what we hoped? So, Jesus' surprising response to all this. Now, if you have your Bible there, look at verse 11. It's so anticlimactic. Jesus comes into town. All these people are waving palm branches, and they're saying these things. It's super, super dramatic, like a once in a lifetime, unbelievable thing. And Jesus comes into town, and it says he looked around and then went home. He does not capitalize on the momentum, right? Now there's even something more significant here. But first of all, keep this in mind. He does not rally the troops now that the troops are all assembled and everyone's excited. He just shuts it all down and just goes home. But even more than that, in a different account, Luke gives us another detail that Mark does not. And that is that as Jesus enters in Jerusalem, he starts to cry. He starts to weep. So here's Luke 19. As he approached Jerusalem and he saw the city, he wept over it. And he said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it's hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and your children within the walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. So he comes into Jerusalem and he recognizes they're not going to receive him. They're not going to welcome him. And he also knows that what's going to happen then is they're going to just keep going and doing what they're doing. And that means the Romans are going to basically come in and overtake them. And again, it's not long after this that's exactly what happened. The Romans come and totally destroy the temple. So, and finally, this is the final thing. I've mentioned this before, but again, it's hard to overestimate how dramatic and powerful and crazy seeming this was. That Jesus, instead of kicking out the Romans from their temple, goes to the temple and kicks out the people helping with sacrifices. And that act, as I said in previous weeks in this series, that's probably the act that was the final turning point. And the Jewish leaders who were already nursing opposition to Jesus completely turned on him. And the crowds, which, on Palm Sunday were saying, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, those same crowds a few days later are going to be calling out, crucify him. And once again, it comes back to this question or this issue of what they're wanting and who Jesus really is. I have talked about this in previous messages in this series, and so I'm not going to belabor the point this morning. But I do want to, again, just bring it up for all of us to reflect on as we're going to pray in just a minute. And that is, we all come to church. We all come to our Christian faith with expectations, with pictures in our minds about what God is going to do, how Jesus is going to solve all of my problems or whatever. I'm not sure what those expectations are. There might be different expectations that each of us have, and uh, I mean, it's almost a guarantee that whatever those expectations are, Jesus is going to bring blessings that will fulfill some of those expectations, and Jesus will challenge some of those expectations. It's almost a guarantee. So all of us have to face this question of, will we serve and follow the real Jesus, or kind of focus on our our own sort of made up pictures of Jesus?